when he comes home. And I was totally thrilled by what I was able to do for this family by letting this 13-year-old young man become independent families. 3 years later, I read an article about the age wave and decided to concentrate my remodeling business on aging in place remodeling. And I was uniformly welcomed to the senior network providers in Montgomery County, Maryland, up here in DC, because they thought it was such a good idea. But nobody ever called. So by the late 90s, I was teaching around the country under Administration on Aging grants and occupational therapists and to contractors and builders and designers, and started to wonder why something that was uniformly such a good idea had no business. Many years later, quite a few years later, about 4 years ago, my good friend John Migliaccio became head of research at MetLife Mature Marketing Institute. And I pitched him the idea of writing about aging in place, and he said, okay, and we negotiated too small a fee. I think you all know about that, right? And he thought I was going to write a guide for consumers about how to buy home modifications. And instead I started to write what I'd seen, which is that there's no good way to sell home modification services, even though it's a really good idea. And what came out of that paper, which is called Aging in Place 2.0, is that there's no good system for consumers to buy services for aging in place, and no good way for providers to sell. And the second thing that came out of it is there's no way that I know of, to influence people to prepare their homes. And if you know anything about remodeling, it really doesn't jive time-wise with the discharge planning system. So there is the idea for me was to write that and then try to solve those problems. And that sort of led us here tonight. So that's a short thing.
Well, that wasn't bad, Louis, but I know Katie can do a better job than you. And I might add, the remodeling system doesn't work on anybody's time.
So for going back to college, right after college, I didn't try to build a solar house, but I went and worked for the Senate. I was a poli-sci major, so when you go work for the United States Senate. I worked for a senator who was chair of the Aging Committee, Senator Tom Eagleton at the time, and I just got completely hooked on these issues. So I spent about 15 years or maybe more at AARP, and I ran their programs area, their consumer education, consumer outreach. That's when I first bumped into Louis, and did a lot of work with AARP on sort of accessible design and all kinds of things. And then I went over to Leading Age, which is where I am now. And we'll talk a little bit about Leading Age, but it is an organization of not-for-profit providers all over the country who provide care and services to people as they age. And most of the services that they provide are to people in their homes, not in the bricks and sticks where they work. So increasingly, Leading Age has become an organization that is totally community-based, and most of our members are real anchors in their communities for providing those services. So I'm very, very interested in this conversation about how do you expand what they do, how do you expand what you do, bring them together. I mean, I think there are tremendous opportunities for networks and integration, so I'm delighted you're all here.
Okay, great, fantastic. Okay, so the second question.